Welcome back to the channel. I'm the Fantasy Football Strategist, and in today's video, I'm going to share with you a couple of ways that you can lose your fantasy football leagues. If you avoid these rookie mistakes, you have a much higher chance at winning your fantasy football leagues. Please remember to like and subscribe. Let's get into it. The first thing to avoid is drafting too many people on the same team. The first point I'm going to bring up is variance. Let's say you have the quarterback, the top receiver, and the running back on one team. From week to week, they may have good games, they may have bad games, they may pass the whole time, they may run the whole time. Well, if you have a team's entire offense and they have a terrible game, and you have multiple players in your starting lineup from the same team that all perform terribly, there's a pretty good chance you lost your week. Sometimes this happens when a new fantasy football player is a fan of a certain team and they want their players. And, there's no problem with wanting players on your roster that are from your favorite team, but balance is very good. Now, sometimes in some offenses, almost every week, that could work out for you. So let's say you're in the playoffs and your team has a very poor week because 3 of your players are all from the same team, and they're your main contributors. It's quite unlikely that you win your matchup, and that's just really disappointing, to be honest with you. But then the other point that I want to bring up is injuries. So let's say that you had Aaron Rodgers, Breece Hall, and Garrett Wilson. Well, Aaron Rodgers got hurt 4 snaps into the season, so if you drafted him, that was a complete miss and a complete dud. Then you had Garrett Wilson. Well, he didn't live up to his expectations because he had Zach Wilson or worse throwing to him. Had he had Aaron Rodgers the whole year, he probably would have been close to the top 5, but as unfortunate as it is to say, it just didn't happen. Then with Breece Hall, he started out really slowly, and if you somehow were able to make it to the fantasy playoffs with no Aaron Rodgers and Garrett Wilson underperforming, he might have been able to win you your fantasy playoff matchups, but it's quite unlikely that you made it there if you spent picks on those other players. And sometimes it could work out for you. Like, let's say you had Jared Goff, Jahmyr Gibbs, and Amon-Ra St. Brown, for instance, or Sam Laporta, a combination of those 3 players. Most weeks, they all performed pretty well, with the exception of Jahmyr Gibbs' slow start. But one Jared Goff injury could have devastated that offense. And you can reduce your exposure to injuries by having different players from different teams. So just don't do that. Avoid that rookie mistake. The next rookie mistake that people make in their drafts is reaching on players that they personally like, whether it be because they just have an affinity for the player, or maybe they're a fan of the team, which kind of goes hand in hand with the point before, but this is different. So it's really important to pay attention to ADP. And this sounds obvious, but most people don't take the time to research where players are going, and so you can get a lot of value if you pay attention to where players generally go in drafts. So let's say you were in a startup and you are in the 4th round of a startup. If you really like a guy, but he's generally going in the 6th round of a startup, and you know that, you can more than likely wait until the 5th or preferably the 6th round to get that player. You may miss out on that player, but you will definitely lose out on value if you reach for people multiple rounds later. And for instance, if you're in a rookie draft, if you're at the end of the 1st round, don't pick a player that's going in the early 3rd round. Wait until you're on the board in the late 2nd round. Because let's say somebody snags that player. Well, that just means somebody that should be going higher is going to fall to you. Don't be the guy that reaches. The other aspect of this is to think of players in tiers. So let's say you are on the clock and you're in a 12-team draft and you're picking 10th. Well, let's say that there are 4 running backs that you like that are the best remaining, and you view them all in the same tier. and there's one wide receiver that you view as the best and is the only player left in his tier. Draft the wide receiver because then you can just wait for one of the running backs to fall to you. And this sounds really simple, but some people really get rushed or get nervous for, whatever reason, and they don't really stop and think about it. The more thought and research you put into your drafts before you're on the clock, the better off you'll be, and you won't panic. The other point is don't start runs, end runs. Granted, if you're at the 101, you have to pick somebody first, so you know what I mean. But don't be the guy that picks the first player in a tier of, 5 to 8 players. Be the guy that gets the last player in that tier. You will gain a lot more value by being the last guy to get a player in a tier than by starting a tier. And that will help you avoid having holes in your roster, because if nobody else values a position, there's no reason for you to overdraft that position. The third rookie mistake to avoid, and this is dynasty draft specific, is to never be in the middle of the pack. You never ever want to be in the middle. First of all, if you are in the middle, obviously you're not going to win. That is the chief priority here. You're trying to win either money or just for the ability to gloat. Likewise, you are also never going to be bad enough, at least in the foreseeable future, to be good. You either want to be really bad so that you can get good quickly, or you just want to be good. It's always preferable, of course, to just always have a contending roster, but that's not always possible. Sometimes, when you do a startup draft, you want to do the punt approach, where you trade down with your startup picks to gain rookie capital in the future. That's a very successful strategy, by the way. If you're okay with eating a year's worth of an entry fee, you can dominate your leagues that way. Likewise, if you just want to win right away, go all in. Staying in the middle of the pack is never going to get you money. Another thing that goes hand in hand with this is to be active. You want to know one way to ensure that you're in the middle of the pack is to just don't really pay too much attention to things, don't be active on the waiver wire, don't try to trade. That's going to lead you to being in the middle of the pack. And as I said a minute ago, you're never going to win money, and you're never ever going to be bad enough to get better. Never be in the middle of the pack. The fourth rookie mistake is drafting for floor or safety. One thing to know is that upside wins championships. Floor prevents you from being dead last. Sure, you don't want to be dead last, but you obviously want to win your fantasy football leagues. Having a bunch of players that are flex-worthy on your roster is not going to win you a fantasy championship. You need to draft for absolute ceiling, because if your players are able to hit that ceiling, you have a much better chance at winning your fantasy football leagues. The fifth and final rookie mistake that people make is basing their opinions all from one source of content. For instance, while it would be incredibly beneficial if everybody came to me for all of their information, it'd be quite profitable for me. It would be extremely disingenuous of me to tell you that, hey, you should only listen to me for your news, or your opinions on players, or thought processes, anything. You want to gather information about a player or a draft strategy, whatever you're trying to figure out, add up all the information gleaned from various sources, and then form an educated opinion on either a player or a strategy or whatever you're forming an opinion on. One bonus tip, by the way. If it comes down to drafting a player that you like or a player that somebody else highly regards, draft a player that you like. Because in a worst-case scenario, you will kick yourself much harder if you didn't draft the player you like and they went off and became extremely valuable, and then the player that you were told to draft busts out. That will be the most frustrated you can possibly be with your decision. Trust yourself, because the lowest of the low is not listening to your thoughts and feelings about a player and then being wrong because you listen to somebody else. So, to review, the 5 tips were not to draft too many players from the same team. Remember that there's weekly variance, so while you may have really high highs, you may have really low lows if they don't perform in any given week, and especially in the playoffs. Then there's also injuries that come into play. If you have the quarterback, receiver, and tight end from a team, for instance, and the quarterback gets hurt, it's incredibly unlikely that the receiver and tight end are going to be able to live up to their ADP. And obviously, if you have the quarterback, he's going to get hurt and he's not going to give you any fantasy points. It's best to protect yourself from this variance by having players from different teams on your team. The second tip is don't reach on players in your drafts. Pay attention to ADP, because you will only lose value if you reach on players, and especially if the player you reached on doesn't outperform where you personally drafted them. There is always a chance that you can wait to get that player, especially if you look at sites in which compile data from past drafts and especially recent drafts. The third tip, and this one was for dynasty managers, is never stay in the middle of the pack. You're never going to win money, and you're never going to be bad enough to be good eventually. You'll just never win but never get good either. If you need to do a little mini rebuild, then do a mini rebuild. Or if you are already a contender and pushing in the chips a little bit will really solidify you as the best team, for instance, go for it. Never be in the middle of the pack. The fourth tip is never ever draft for floor or safety. Fielding a team of flex players is almost certainly not going to win you a fantasy championship. Draft for ceiling, because if your players hit their ceiling, there is a much better chance that you win your fantasy leagues. Once again, fielding a team of flex-worthy players is not going to win you your fantasy championships. And the fifth and final point, don't base all of your opinions based on what one source tells you. Once again, it would be incredibly disingenuous of me to tell you to only listen to what I have to say about players. It would help me, but it wouldn't help you. Listen to different sources of information, compile what we tell you, and then form your own opinions. It can never hurt you to have an educated opinion on a player or a situation or a draft strategy. So those are 5 things that if you choose to do will almost certainly make you a loser in fantasy football. If you avoid all of those rookie mistakes, you have a much better chance at winning your fantasy championships. But what do you think? Do you agree, disagree? What are tips that you have that have helped you win fantasy championships in the past? Please let me know in the comment section below. With that being said, I'm a fantasy football strategist, your NFL breaking news source, and the dynasty and redraft implications behind said breaking news. I am building a library of information with which you can use to dominate your redraft and dynasty leagues in 2024 and the future. Please remember to like and subscribe. It would mean the absolute world to me. Thank you and have a good day.